Howdy, welcome to Chapter 5, Part 2. In this, we want to continue building on competitor analysis. So to complete a competitor analysis, firms study market commonality and resource similarity. In general, the greater the market commonality and resource similarity, the more firms acknowledge that they are direct competitors, or perhaps rivals. So market commonality is concerned with the number of markets in which the firm and a competitor are jointly involved and the degree of importance of the individual markets to each. Firms competing against one another in several markets engage in multi-market competition. Now, I want you to pay attention to this. In general, multi-market competition reduces competitive rivalry, but some firms will still compete when the potential rewards or the potential market share gain are high. The reason that multi-market competition can reduce competitive rivalry is because of essentially mutual forbearance, where if you are competing with the same firm in every product market or every geographic market that you go, the risk of attacking them and receiving a response may end up outweighing the potential gains. So as an example here, let's look at the geographic distribution of Five Guys. We'll see that they're pretty well dispersed around the country. We may look at White Castle, which, by the way, if you've never had White Castle, don't bother, it's not very good. But you will see here that they are primarily on the east, and then they decided to compete in California in a little bit. Unfortunately, they're getting a little too close being there in Vegas. We also may look here at Culver's. So Culver's, which you're very likely familiar with at this point, started in the Midwest, and that's really where they're concentrated. And then they have started to reach out and to seek new markets. You notice that there are no Culver's here in California. Whataburger is a Texas-based chain. You'll see with each of these that some of them overlap with, well, they all overlap with Five Guys, but they don't necessarily overlap much with one another. Whataburger is extremely popular in Texas, but then it overlaps only a little bit with In-N-Out. So In-N-Out, in fact, Whataburger starting in Texas and expanding out, and In-N-Out starting in California and moving east, they have started to overlap. And so they're starting to become closer and closer in their level of competition. But that's something that has happened over time. When you look at these different examples, you can see that not every firm or all of these firms overlap differently with one another. And that's going to influence the level of competitive rivalry that they feel. With resource similarity, we're looking at how comparable the firm's tangible and intangible resources are to a competitor's in firms of both types and amounts. Firms with similar types and amounts of resources are likely to have similar strengths and weaknesses and to use similar strategies. Assessing resource similarity is difficult if critical resources are intangible rather than tangible. For example, consider the value of a brand. Consider the value of a logo, perhaps. It's hard to overcome the competitive advantage that Nike receives from the swoosh logo. That's intangible. However, there are some things that you would be able to compare, and you'd be able to find different ways to overcome different advantages that other firms may have. To look at resource similarity, I want to use the example of airline fleets. So you'll notice here that there are a number of different aircraft used by these four airlines. So some of them, like the Airbus A319 and the A320, are in a similar size category as the Boeing 737. They are used similarly for similar length flights. Most of the domestic flights that you'll take in the United States are going to be on one of these three types of aircraft. You'll also be able to see that there are some differences where of these four, only United has some of the larger planes, getting up close to 3 and even close to 400 passengers on a particular plane. These planes tend to be used differently. Look at Southwest, that has a similar number of planes to United, but it's a different type of plane that they use. Consider Alaska, which is a little bit, is kind of in between Allegiant and Southwest on the number of aircraft, a lot of overlap on the type, with each of the others, and yet Southwest and Allegiant don't overlap at all in the make of plane, but they do very much in the size and the usage, or the type of usage that you could get from their planes. When we look at these different airline fleets, we'll see that they happen to be used differently. So here's United's flight map. They're all over the place. They're all over the United States. They also take the long flights, and these are the flights that are primarily used by those, these are the flights that primarily use those larger aircraft that hold a lot more people. They're not as efficient or as fast to get people on and off. However, once they get 350 people on a flight, they'll take that flight and it may take 10+ hours. Now look at Southwest. With a similar number of planes, they have stuck with a domestic strategy for the most part, with a little bit of international, but still not really going for longer distances. Allegiant, of course, has a primarily domestic strategy, and they really focus on one-way flights or direct flights, using a unique strategy really of focusing on getting people from warm weather or from cold weather places to warm weather vacation destinations. We can also look at Alaska, and they will have a similar number of flights to perhaps Allegiant with a more or less similar number of planes. But you'll notice, of course, despite resource differences, they actually overlap on market, going back to the previous concept, but they overlap differently, and they use their resources differently as well. So to look at this framework, we can identify in a quadrant whether any two firms have high or low market commonality and high or low resource similarity. If you look at two firms that are extremely similar, if you were to take Wendy's and Burger King, their market commonality is extremely high. Their resources are also very similar. We would put them up in quadrant 1. If we were to take Ryanair, for example, and put them up against Southwest Airlines, their resource similarity is actually quite high, but their market commonality, US versus Europe, is very low. So we might put that in quadrant 4. And we could take any two companies and put them in these different quadrants, and you'd be able to see that those in quadrant 1 are likely to have very high rivalry. Those in quadrant 3 are much likely to have a much lower level of rivalry. We can do the same thing for Coke and Pepsi. Where are they high? Where are they low? What about tangible versus intangible resources? Where do their markets overlap? Where do they not overlap? How do they target different customers in different ways? We might do the same thing with Airbus versus Boeing. They target very similar companies. They have very similar resources. In fact, the reality is that most passengers can't even tell the difference from one make to another unless they really know some pretty specific differences between the models. So for question number 2, I want you to describe resource similarities and differences in market similarity between Coke and Pepsi. Again, consider tangible versus intangible resources, consider types of products sold, consider geographic location, and who's being targeted in each, and how those two companies interact with each other.